Another Nobel laureate, Yasunari Kawabata, referred to the Japanese art of landscape stones in Japan, the Beautiful and Myself, the speech that he read upon receiving the Nobel Prize on December the 12th, 1968. He said, I quote, "Nothing is more complicated, varied, attentive to detail than the Japanese art of landscape gardening. Thus, there is the form called the dry landscape, composed entirely of rocks, in which the arrangement of stones gives expression to mountains and rivers that are not present, and even suggests the waves of the great ocean breaking in upon cliffs. Compressed to the ultimate, the Japanese garden becomes the bonsai dwarf garden, or the bonseki, its dry version." Suseki, an abbreviation of the term Sansui Keiseki, which approximately translates as landscape view stone or landscape scenery stone, is a cornerstone of traditional Japanese aesthetics. It was adopted from China through Korea. In China, imaginative stones are still called gonshi or guaishi, fantastic or strange stones, or also shangsek. In Korea, they are presently known as useok, eternal stones. In Japan, the tradition of recognizing images in stones was increasingly perfected and articulated, gaining peculiar characteristics. Beginning in the Muromachi period, particularly in the Nambuko-cho period era, 1336-1392, it flourished under Emperor Go-Daigo, who was an avid collector of imaginative stones and became popular in the late Edo and early Meiji periods. In Japan, too, imaginative stones have inspired both poets and painters. The scholar, poet, and painter Rai Sanyo must have contemplated at length a stone in his possession, which tradition entitles Li Po, meditating on a waterfall. Originally found in China on Mount Lu Shan in the Fujian province, it was likely brought to Japan in 1654. The black and white reproduction allows one to appreciate the chromatic, color, eidetic, shape, and topological position elements, encouraging the gaze to recognize in the stone a human figure placidly sitting on a rock. The attribution of a verbal title reinforces the visual identification and adds details to it. The petrified man is the great Chinese poet Li Po, engrossed in meditation before a waterfall. The bottom part of the stone represents itself in a sublimated version as pedestal for spiritual meditation and poetic musing. It is no wonder that this stone might have appealed to Rai Sanyo, who is remembered as one of the finest kanshi poets of his time. In contemplating the stone, he must have beheld a sort of petrified, immobile version of his ideal role model in a Mizanabim wherein a poet would ponder the stony effigy of another poet who was in turn meditating while sitting on a rock. The pragmatic effect of the fractal contemplation must have been enhanced by the unfinished quality of the stone, by its infinite and impalpable mutability under light and gaze. Digression into a delicate page in the history of Suseki should encourage appreciation of cross-cultural and trans-historical sensibility. The Paesine of Florence inspired the poetry of Pablo Neruda in the 20th century. As a fine specimen of Japanese Suseki must have stirred Rai Sanyo's imagination in the early 19th century. Imaginative stones offer visual clues that human cognition is compelled, almost constrained, to complete through identification of a represented subject and apposition of a name. But differences in the cultural reception of this common cognitive principle should not be neglected. First, whereas imaginative stones became a proper aesthetic genre in China, Korea, and especially Japan, they were mostly a mere curiosity in the Western artistic tradition that resulted in discrepant levels of specificity in articulation. Today, the Nippon Suseki Association officially distinguishes between Toyama-ishi, that is, stones representing distant mountains, Shimagata-ishi, having island-like forms, Iwagata-ishi, resembling seaside cliffs, Tamara-ishi, or water pool stones, Taki-ishi, representing waterfalls, Doha, containing the figure of an open plain, Danseki, including the figure of a stepped or terraced plain, Katsuya-ishi, having the form of old cottages, Sugata-ishi, resembling humans, saints, or animals, Monyo-seki, with specific surface patterns, subdivided into Baikaseki and Kikaseki. This is just the beginning of the articulation, which is very maniacal. For the sake of pursuing the parallel inquiry into the history and aesthetics of imaginative stones in the East and in the West, it should be mentioned that 16th century Italian naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi attempted an analogous classification. The founder of Bologna's Botanical Garden and a pioneer of European natural history, according to both Linnaeus and the Comte de Buffon, Ulisse Aldrovandi was also an encyclopedic collector of curiosity. In 1648, he published the Museum Metallicum in Libros Quatuor, literally the Metallic Museum, a monumental work of 1,000 pages divided into 4 sections, in which he listed, categorized, and described material and symbolical characteristics of all minerals known at that time. The concept of natura ludens, playful nature, capricious nature, or ludus naturae, joke of nature, caprice of nature, recurs in the work. 16th and 17th century European naturalists referred to it when accounting for bizarre forms found in nature. The idea implied not only that nature was endowed with autonomous agency, but that this agency could be playful and, in certain cases, artistically imaginative. In the Museum Metallicum, Aldrovandi articulates all the mineral products of nature's playfulness. Exactly like in Japanese Suseki, he attributes names to categories of stones depending on what they resemble. For instance, he denominates chrysocolosintites, stones that are shaped like gourds. Aldrovandi includes as products of lusus naturae also several pseudo-imaginative stones that modern paleontology would classify as mere fossils. Therefore, he singles out and denominates as many species of stones as there are kinds of fossils. For instance, he proposes to call arengites the stone in which playful nature has impressed the figure of a herring. Although some ancient scholars would interpret these images as traces of extinct living beings, variously explaining the phenomenon, Aristotle, Avicenna, Albert of Saxony, etc., the idea they were actually resulting from the figurative capriciousness of nature persisted well into modernity. Interesting, among the first scholars who realized that fossils were not icons of living beings, but indexes, that is, imprints of them, many were not only scientists but also artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Girolamo Fracastoro, and Bernard Palissy. On the contrary, at least until the publication of the Herbarium Diluvianum by Johann Jakob Scheuchzer in 1709, and even better until the publication of Histoire des végétaux fossiles by Adolphe Brongniart 1828-1847, many scholars, including Aldrovandi, believed that nature could paint and sculpt within itself as though endowed with artistic agency. Thus, Aldrovandi devoted a section of his treatise to the lapides cum figuris a natura factis, stones with figures made by nature. Understandably, stones carrying such prodigious effigies would promptly become divination omens. Here the West meets the East again. Aldrovandi quotes a book that had been published in Rome only 5 years earlier, in 1643, by Álvaro Semedo, a Portuguese Jesuit missionary in China. Relazione della Grande Monarchia della Cina, Report on the Great Monarchy of China. Chapter 18 of the first book is entitled Delle Sette della Cina, on the sects of China. First, Semedo compares the religiosity of China with that of Japan. I cinesi sono universalmente poco inclinati alle sette, né in gran parte arrivano agli giapponesi. The Chinese are universally little inclined to sects, and in this domain do not usually match the Japanese. Christianity had been banned from Japan in 1630, that maybe pushed Semedo to such comparison. He then relates the episode quoted by Aldrovandi. Some Taozi philosophers, that is, followers of Lao Tzu's Taoism, preach in the main square of Beijing in 1622. They promise that their prayers will conjure rain, wished for by all citizens after a long drought. However, at the exact time indicated by the prophecy, what falls from the sky is not rain, but strange stones which devastate the city and the countryside. The anti-Taoist zeal of Álvaro Semedo is an evident bias in the story. The enraged crowd beats the fake prophets, preparing the arrival of the truthful Christian preachers. Aldrovandi is not immune from this religious bias. That suggests some more general insights about how human beings identify images in nature. On the one hand, as it was pointed out earlier, certain cognitive features of this process are probably cross-cultural. Page 756 of Aldrovandi's Museum Metallicum contains the reproduction of a prodigious marble showing the effigy of a hermit. The marble that in mid-17th century led the Italian naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi to recognize a hermit therein can be compared with the Sugata Ishi that in the early 19th century encouraged the Japanese poet Rai Sanyo to identify in it the effigy of a meditating poet. Neurophysiological research suggests that human beings are inclined to recognize face-like or body-like visual patterns in nature, probably because such capacity proved adaptive in the past. Thanks to it, aggressors, dissimulating their presence in the environment through hiding or camouflage, could be unmasked. Furthermore, the idea of associating the image of a stone with that of the immobile meditation of a hermit must have been appealing both in the East and in the West. However, 3 pages later, Aldrovandi reproduces a similar prodigious marble containing a non-human-made image of crucifixion. In this case, the marble might well present observers with a curiously cruciform chromatic, eidetic, and topological pattern. However, observers who identify not only a body, but the crucified body of Jesus do so because hold such iconography in their visual cultural memory. A 14th century Japanese observer would have never recognized a crucifixion in this stone. So, thus far, my point is very simple. As human beings, we are all endowed with the same cognitive mechanism. We are endowed with this cognitive mechanism as a species and not as a culture. This cognitive mechanism pushes us to what specialists call pareidolia, from eidos in Greek, that means figure, image. Although there aren't any images in the environment, we are almost compelled to recognize them and to recognize especially figures of faces and bodies in the environment, for instance in trunks, in bushes, in the forest. This is something that we all share as a species. Nevertheless, this biological, neurophysiological instinct is molded by our visual culture. We can recognize not only a face, but the face of Jesus only if our visual culture includes such iconography.